For decades, we've been told that human-generated CO2 emissions are the single most dangerous threat to our planet. Politicians, celebrities and the mainstream media have united to amplify this alarm, warning of an impending climate catastrophe unless we act now. But what if the story's wrong? What if the very foundation of the theory, the idea that CO2 is the principal driver of global warming, is flawed? What if the science we've been told is settled is actually far from settled? This week I've been digging into this very provocative question, looking at an extremely interesting recent report on the subject, and what I've found might make you rethink a lot of what you thought you knew about climate change.
Welcome to You Politics UK. This is something for the weekend.
For years we've been fed a simple story. Humans burn fossil fuels, releasing carbon dioxide, CO2, into the atmosphere. CO2 traps heat, causing the planet to warm. The greenhouse effect, as it's known. The solution? Reduce CO2 to save the planet. But what if this narrative is overly simplistic, or even fundamentally wrong? At the recent International Clintel Science Conference in Prague, leading climate experts gathered to scrutinise the dominant narratives around climate change. One of the most striking contributions came from Professor Demetris Koutsoyiannis, a highly regarded climate scientist from the University of Athens. His research challenges the very core of our understanding of CO2's role in the climate system. Professor Koutsoyiannis presented groundbreaking findings that question the long-held belief that rising CO2 levels cause global temperatures to increase. Instead, his research suggests it's the other way around. Global temperature increases drive higher atmospheric CO2 levels. This isn't an entirely new idea. For decades, scientists like Dr. Patrick Moore, a co-founder of Greenpeace, have pointed to evidence showing that historically, rises in CO2 levels have followed, not preceded, global temperature increases. Ice core data, spanning millions of years, apparently supports this claim. If true, this challenges the foundation of the mainstream climate narrative. But why would rising temperatures cause an increase in CO2 levels? Professor Koutsoyiannis explains that when temperatures rise, the natural world responds. Plants and oceans release more CO2 than they otherwise would. Warmer temperatures lead to a thriving environment. Now, I think this needs some explanation because plants absorb CO2 and produce oxygen, not release CO2, don't they? Well, yes. Plants sustain themselves and grow through the process of photosynthesis, which turns sunlight, water and CO2, which plants absorb, into glucose, which enables plants to grow and which produces oxygen as a byproduct, which we and animals need to breathe. However, plants also release CO2 as part of a process known as cellular respiration during the day and particularly at night when, due to a lack of sunlight, photosynthesis cannot occur. On balance, photosynthesis typically outweighs respiration, so living plants typically absorb more CO2 than they release. But when that increasing number of plants die and decompose, microorganisms break down the organic matter, releasing retained CO2. Oceans also release CO2 into the atmosphere when the water is warmer than the surrounding air. Warmer water holds less dissolved CO2. These natural processes account for the majority of CO2 emissions. In fact, Koutsoyiannis argues that nature contributes 96% of CO2 emissions, leaving just 4% attributable to human activity. Yes, burning fossil fuels adds CO2 to the atmosphere. However, the professor's research suggests that human contributions are a mere drop in the ocean compared to natural emissions. Crucially, his data shows that the dominant greenhouse gases aren't CO2, but water vapour and clouds. CO2, it seems, plays a much smaller role than we've been led to believe. Additionally, the study challenges the claim that CO2 lingers in the atmosphere for thousands of years. Instead, it finds that CO2 is rapidly cycled through the atmosphere, oceans and land, with an average cycle of just 4 years. The paper also concludes, based on the data gathered over the last 100 years, when the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere has increased from around 300 parts per million to just over 400 parts per million, that this increase has had no discernible effect on the greenhouse effect. It's that small a factor. If this research is accurate, it doesn't mean climate change isn't real, but it does suggest we need a better understanding of what drives it. The professor asks a number of pertinent, unanswered questions at the end of his paper. The Earth is currently, when viewed over hundreds of millions of years, going through a relatively cool period. What caused the huge increases in Earth's temperature in the past? The professor asks. It wasn't industrialisation, was it? These are crucial questions. especially as governments implement sweeping policies in the name of achieving net zero emissions by 2050. Policies that impact everything from energy prices to housing and transportation, even the food that we eat. The global cost of the net zero agenda is projected to be between $100 and $150 trillion by 2050. Meanwhile, the World Bank estimates that eradicating extreme poverty globally would cost just 3 to 4 trillion. Universal healthcare and education, defeating diseases such as malaria on a global basis would cost less. What if we're funneling trillions into solving something that isn't actually the main source of the problem? What if we should be spending more on other things that can limit global warming? What if we should instead be spending more money on mitigating the effects rather than trying to prevent it? Shouldn't we demand more scrutiny of the science driving these decisions? Could it be that the climate crisis narrative isn't just about science, but also about power, control and profit? Entire industries are heavily invested in the CO2 narrative, and millions of people and much of the mainstream media are emotionally invested in the quest to reduce CO2 to save the planet. But is that what we're actually doing? Science thrives on debate and scrutiny. Science is never settled as such. It's constantly evolving, particularly in complex areas such as global climate. Yet the CO2 science we're proceeding on the basis of is decades old, and many of the models on which it is based have failed to make accurate predictions. Yet those who challenge the mainstream climate narrative are often dismissed as deniers or attacked personally. But shouldn't the truth welcome scrutiny? Shouldn't we demand transparency and evidence that can stand up to rigorous examination? This isn't about denying climate change. It's about questioning whether we're focusing on the right solutions. As more scientists speak out, surely it's time to demand open debate and consider whether the trillions we're spending on net zero might be better used elsewhere. Now, I'm not a climate scientist. Perhaps this report is flawed. Perhaps it is complete nonsense even. But the professor who wrote it is not the only one who's pointing out the first fundamental point, that the mainstream narrative is fundamentally wrong, that by burning fossil fuels we're producing CO2 that is warming the planet. An increasing number of others are breaking ranks and saying exactly the same thing, that increasing CO2 is largely a consequence of increasing global temperatures, not the cause. Yet we're told that we're facing a climate emergency. We must cast aside all caution. We must listen to Greta Thunberg, the climate change messiah. To ask questions is heresy. Really? What do you think? Should we blindly follow the mainstream narrative, or should we dig deeper and ask tougher questions? Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and please remember to like, subscribe, repost and share this video. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time on You Politics UK. Thanks again.